Welcome to the Advertising Forum. This is episode 2 of our new series, The New Rules of Streaming, sponsored by Philo.
Today we have Rob Norman, a member of the board and advisor for multiple ad tech companies across our space, companies including MIQ, Simplify, and Reddit. So he's here with us today to chat about the new rules of streaming. Rob, welcome to the Advertising Forum.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Rob, in the streaming space, it used to be looked at as a disruptor. It is no longer a disruptor. It's actually become the default for many brands and advertisers in the space. But what new responsibilities does this place in our ecosystem have from an advertiser and platform and agency's perspective?
Well, it's obviously a huge issue. I mean, when I stopped working full-time in the business, streaming was a curio, and we were firmly of the view then that there would never be ads on Netflix, that there were unlikely ever to be ads on Amazon Prime, and certainly never ads on HBO. That was never a consideration. Now here we are. We have ads on every platform, and we now have a blended business model for all of those parties, in which you have a very overt contract between the user and the streamer that says, depending on how much you're prepared to pay, that will depend on the ad load from 0 to a lot that you are going to experience in exchange for that, which means that all the people that use streaming platforms have a blended array of experiences, because some of them they're prepared to pay super premium rates for to be ad-free or as good as, and others, perhaps as occasional users, they want to pay either nothing or a lot less for, and therefore signify a tolerance for advertising. So it's important for brand owners not to think about each of the streaming platforms in a kind of unitary or monolithic kind of way. They need to think about the blend of user experiences. The exception, of course, I guess, is people like Philo, where nobody is paying directly and everybody is getting a similar ad load. But everywhere else, it's a pretty customized experience. And I think as Scott Galloway said a few years ago, if you're smart enough or rich enough, you never need to see an ad again. But I think he said that before HBO, Netflix, and Amazon started paying advertising. And now you have to be very rich never to see an ad again. I've tried it, and trust me, you need to be very rich, and I'm insufficiently so. So understand first of all that people are having different experiences of these platforms. And then when you think about it from the platform's point of view, you have to think about, what does it look like to stitch ads into the streaming experience? Because your opportunity is to say, I'm starting from 0. Now, what can I do to make the ads work? Am I better off showing a longer pod at the beginning, or on a couple of occasions in an hour, or am I better going back towards the cable format, if you like, of a number of years ago? And I think, to the enormous credit of the streamer, and I guess the persistence of the consumer, that actually the ad experience is still pretty much everywhere I can think of in the streaming world a better experience than it was in a basic cable world. So to a degree, at least, the consumer has won. And from an agency point of view, I think you then have to think about, in that use case, how many ads in a pod, how many pods in an hour, how you're going to manage frequency and delivery within that, and think about those issues of creative rotation and creative repeating in order to firm things in people's minds, and just weigh it against the individual streamer and weigh it against the use case for the audience of those streamers. So that's a lot in there, but it's important.
No, this is great. Rob, we knew you were coming into this, and I'm always excited to talk to you. This is not the first time for me or Jeremy. Thank you for such great insight on the agency perspective and on the platform perspective. I did want to ask you one question as it relates to the types of data or audience signals that are most important for advertisers and agencies to focus on. What are those to you, and where do you see the blind spots?
Well, if you go back and think about how people thought about television, it was understood to be a big and broad medium, and you used it to do big and broad things, which was to build awareness and preference for large distribution brands in broad target audiences. And people used to ask the question, how do you reach light viewers on TV? It was a very, very popular question amongst client and agencies. And my old boss, Owen Gottlieb, had the defining answer to that question, which is unimprovable. He said, oh, don't try and reach them on TV, because if they're light viewers on TV, they're going to be doing something else. So why would you do that? And he made a very good point indeed. And so the amount of data that was involved, apart from an estimation of the audiences and estimation of the demographics of those audience, was actually relatively light, because what you would do, by and large, is you would develop a model and you would then relate that model, broad brushstrokes, largely speaking, of TV, whether they're regional or demographic or flighting brushstrokes, and look at how they impacted sales of a brand over time. And everyone would build a model to do that. And then you would look in a rather sort of slow but effective way about how the whole world of business churned through the world of television advertising. So that's what you do. And so no one was really distracted, apart from in 800 number driven DRTV, by the direct relationship between the delivery of a spot and a specific response by some or all of the audience. You just didn't do it because you didn't think about the medium in that way. And what's happened, I think, as a consequence of things like last click attribution in digital display and elsewhere, is that people have kind of run towards we're running a spot. What is the impact of that spot? How are things moving? And they're getting, I think, frustrated because the medium doesn't really work like that. And so, to my mind, what you're looking for is some signals that say, what kind of packages of content are specific households starting to use? How does it blend together? How does sports go with drama, go with reality, go with whatever else it may have to be? And how do you get those specific signals about what devices are exposed to what media? So, of course, we have ACR data, which I suspect is the best available data in understanding what content goes to which device. So ACR data, whether it's the Samba data set or the LG data set or the Samsung data set or a bunch of it, or the Vizio data set, is super valuable because it starts modeling out particular households. And if you can frame that watching data on TV alongside some other signals like browsing data from other internet activity and transactional signals from shopping areas, so what do people watch, what do they browse for, and what do they buy? And you can start triangulating those signals. You start moving to a place where you can do meaningful attribution. But don't get distracted by the idea that a single spot has run. We need to know everything that happened immediately afterwards.
So, Rob, that's a great point. How are you seeing content and audience diversity merge with media responsibility, brand safety, actually show up in this day and age versus how the evolution was 5 years ago, 7 years ago? Because you just talked about all these different data sets, all this different fragmentation, people on the go.
Well, so I was a brand safety hawk in my days at Group M, and my colleague John Montgomery and I, I was called in the sheriff in that world, and we spend a lot of time doing it. And we were very concerned with brand safety and viewability. We thought about that a lot because our view of the universe was we shouldn't pay for an ad that hasn't been seen, and that we shouldn't be buying ads in environments that would be either dangerous at worst or unsuitable in other circumstances for our customers. I sort of got an evolved view of that now. I'm much more kind of brand suitability person than I am a brand safety person. I actually believe, and this is an interesting concept, that viewers create context every bit as much as viewers create content. I think that almost all media is an elective choice. So I have chosen to watch that. So it is what it is. And if I've chosen to watch it, that, running an ad in it doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. Now, clearly, people are going to have red lines about what they don't want to do. But I think the CTV environment is infinitely less polluted by the hardcore brand safety issue than the thing we knew as the open web and YouTube a decade ago, which was heavily polluted by the brand safety issue. So I think the brand suitability issue is important. And then when you get to brand suitability issues, you're then using things like ACR data because you can have a sense of the profile of the content that's consumed to a particular device. I'm not sure I get as much into the fragmentation thing as some people do. I feel that people have got a relatively restricted menu of platforms that they use in their house. I know that I have 4 streamers, maybe 5 sometimes in my house. I think that's not unusual for people to have 4 or 5. So I think piecing it together isn't a terrible thing. Although the persistent challenge is that, and this is going to make me feel like a very old-fashioned or sound like a very old-fashioned person, it's very difficult to do kind of what we would have thought of as straightforward reach and frequency work, given the nature of the streaming environment now.
I don't think that makes you sound, I don't think it's an antiquated perspective, to put it bluntly. In your experience, what does working with the right partners mean in an industry that's constantly consolidating, but at the same time craving differentiation?
Well, I've always thought the right partners are the people that did what they say they were going to do. And then you can choose.
Having a high do-to-say ratio.
Well, yeah. Right. And if you liked what it is that they said they were going to do, you could choose to work with them. If you didn't, then you didn't. The hard ones were when people say they would do one thing and did another thing. That was always kind of complicated. So I think choosing partners is that it's a bit of a use case specific thing, because how you would think of kind of attribution and the kind of metrics you would look for if you were in a kind of D2C brand, or if you were in the, whatever it means, the growth marketing world, how you would think about partners and the campaigns you're trying to deliver there would be different from the way you would think about the world if you were looking at a big, long, persistent brand delivery over time, when you're trying to move preference metrics over years and decades. And so there are now more horses because there are more courses, and you would be picking them depending on what the objective was. I think there's a great danger of one size fits allism, because clearly the world is not like that. And to work with your customer, if you're an agency, to really establish what the goals at the brand level, corporate level, the brand level, and the campaign level are, you should determine, when you've established those first questions, what your media plan looks like, but also what your ad tech stack looks like and what your measurement stack looks like, to make sure that you're measuring the thing that is the objective that you started with.
I respect that. If you could rewrite one legacy belief from the linear TV era that no longer applies in streaming, what would it be?
I think what's happened now is that anyone that's hanging on to the old definition of the upfront as a futures market and thinking you can kind of call it by that analysis of supply and demand is probably going to struggle. But anyone that thinks it's become an entirely spot market and there is no value in futures is wrong as well. So to me, the rules I would rewrite are the ones that are related to finding the balance between reserve markets and spot markets. And I would look at bringing in the idea of biddable as we understand it now with the upfront market as we understood it then, and understand when we look at each of the streaming partners and any other partners where there is going to be restricted supply, because in all the places where there's restricted supply, we then have to go through the exercise of valuing the appropriate price for an upfront commitment. And that's the kind of evolved state that I would like to think people would get to.
Rob, you always bring an incredible perspective. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of the Advertising Forum called The New Rules of Streaming. It's sponsored by Philo. Rob, I'm really looking forward to chatting with you again, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rob.